Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everybody. For this lecture, we'll be talking about the function of art as opposed to the nature and purpose. So, jumping right on in. So, art informs us by meeting deep and subtle needs. And so, some of these needs would be things like religion, self expression, past identity, etc., etc., etc. And so, the artwork is going to interact with these needs within our perception in a myriad of different ways, and once again all of this is very subjective. However, six major functions of art in the social and cultural context include things like delight, commentary, worship, commemoration, persuasion, and self-expression. And we'll be looking at all of the ways that art might go about doing these things today. So, obviously, one of the major focuses or functions of art is just to be a pleasing object. Think about a painting on a wall, things like that. But it can be used to make comments on different historical attributes or social attributes, things like that. It can be used for religious purposes. It can be used to commemorate certain things or people. It can be used to persuade us to adopt certain information, whether that be good or bad. And obviously, it can be used to express ourselves and everything like this. So, to get our own personal expression out there for others to see. So, we will see examples of all of these things today. So, art and delight. Delight is a major goal of art. It brings us enjoyment, as an aesthetically pleasing object. So, painting on a wall, it can, provide us enjoyment that way. It can be pleasurable. So, if the subject matter is very pleasing, like a floral still life or something like that, it can be very interesting in that regard. It can also add decoration or embellishment to a space, so it can make interacting or existing within a space more pleasurable. But it can also be used as a form of amusement, so things like film or entertainment, theater, all these kinds of things. So delight is a major aspect of artwork in general. Now, you probably heard me use this word quite a bit last time, and you're going to hear me use it quite a bit more. Part of this recognition of delight in art is the recognition of aesthetics. And aesthetics is or refers to an awareness of beauty or the quality in a work of art or other man made or natural forms which evokes a sense of elevated awareness in the viewer. Now, I like this nice little diagram here because just because something has artistic value doesn't necessarily mean it has aesthetic value or beauty or vice versa. So, obviously, a lot of artwork falls in this middle where it has artistic value, beauty, and aesthetics all rolled into one. But something can have artistic value and aesthetic value without necessarily be considered beautiful. And likewise, it could have artistic value without having aesthetic value or beauty whatsoever. And so we'll see some examples of that. But once again, this is all very subjective. It's going to be based largely on us as the viewer and what, kind of ideas we bring to the table in connection to whatever work of art we're looking at. Now, when we are talking about this idea of beauty, though, we do have to also recognize another term, and that is classical. And that is referring to the traditions of ancient Greece and Rome that set the standard for beauty in Western art. And indeed, they set the standard for beauty in our society as well. So our idea of what beauty is basically comes from ancient Greece and Rome. And it's this kind of idealized perfection, such as the Venus de Milo, which we see here. Very famous sculpture, represents, Venus or Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire. But it's very much an aesthetically pleasing object in that her form, the female form, has been very heavily idealized to remove all humanly flaws whatsoever. And so our idea of beauty or classical beauty really comes from things like this. So, In art, beauty is often considered through things like pleasantry, inspiring subjects. So, is it pleasing to look at? Does the subject matter give us something to contemplate or something to reinterpret the world with? Whatever, things like that. But also, is the work of art thoughtfully executed? Is it done well? Does it have good technique to it? Does it use things like harmonious colors? Is it, very soothing to the eye in terms of the colors used, or is it really jarring and violent in that regard? But also, does it have pleasing composition? Is it, does it follow a nice kind of undulating curve versus really sharp, harsh angles and things like that? So all of these can be considered in terms of recognizing beauty within a work of art. So here we can see a work of art that most people, I feel, would say was very beautiful, very aesthetically pleasing. And this is Francois Boucher's Mercury Confiding the Infant Bacchus to the Nymphs of Nicaea. And this is a very, very nice example of what's known as Rococo art. This is an almost exclusively French art form from the 18th century. Most of it deals with the kind of aristocratic lifestyle of the French nobility, but it also deals a lot with ancient Greco-Roman mythology. In particular, a lot of it deals with transformation, mythology or love stories, things along those lines. But here we can see a kind of very pleasing representation of a very tragic kind of love story. And so just generally speaking, we might consider this beautiful because, like most Rococo artwork, it has this very, very harmonious, pleasing color palette that's made up of these really soft pastel colors. We also see this kind of nice use of primary colors like red, yellow, blue, and all of that. But we also have this really nice kind of curving form as these gods descend from the heavens and all of this. But even though this is a very harmonious, very pleasing looking subject, it actually kind of hides a darker undertone. So in the story, if we're unfamiliar, Bacchus, the infant here, is the Greco-Roman god of wine. And he's born of Zeus and a mortal woman named Salome. And in the story, Zeus likes to, have affairs with mortal women in disguise. And so he, gets Salome pregnant. And Zeus's wife, Hera, is not too thrilled about this, obviously. So she goes to Salome and she tricks her. And she says, if Zeus really loves you, he will reveal his godly splendor to you. And so you must convince him of this as well. And so Salome does this, and she convinces Zeus to reveal his true godly form instead of his masquerade to her. And as soon as he does this, she instantly bursts into fire and burns alive. And so at the last minute, Mercury swoops in and, snatches up the infant Bacchus before he perishes. And he takes him to Zeus, who finishes, rearing him and then, or at least, kind of gestating him. And then once he is born, he's taken to the nymphs of Nicaea for safekeeping from Hera's wrath. And so it's kind of a dark story, but we have this very, very kind of lovely, pleasing scene that's taking part in this. So this is a painting that would be considered to have not only aesthetic beauty or value, but beauty itself, as well as artistic value as well. And how, Boucher is actually, going about the painting of it and everything. That is opposed to, say, works like this. This is very, very much a painting that most people, in fact, not if not all people, would say is not beautiful. It's not aesthetically pleasing. But what we see here, this is Otto Dix Der Krieg triptych. And Der Krieg is German. It means the war. And this is meant to be an autobiographical account of Otto Dix's personal experience fighting in the German army during the First World War. And so, most notably, Otto Dix was a machine gunner in the German army. He was present at the Battle of the Somme. in which he participated in cutting down 60,000 British soldiers on the first day of a 3-month battle alone. And this is something that really haunted him for the rest of his life. In fact, in his memoirs, he talks about recurring nightmares about that experience on the Somme and everything like this. So we can see that actually represented in this painting. And if we move from the left to the right and then from up to down, in the far left panel here, we can see this kind of ghostly column of soldiers marching off into the haze, almost as if to symbolically show their kind of oblivion, if you will. They're nameless, they're faceless, and they're going off to this unknown circumstance. Now, in the center, the main panel, we see the aftermath of what's known as a drum fire artillery barrage. And this is an artillery barrage that's so intense, it literally sounds like a drum roll. And in fact, most of the soldiers who survived these experiences actually talked about them being so intense that you would only hear white noise because of the intensity. Many people would go deaf from these experiences. But in these attacks, each of these armies would fire 3 million plus shells a day, every day, 24 hours, 7 days a week, for weeks, if not months on end. And so what really results from this is almost utter devastation. And so what we see here is Otto Dick's depiction of that devastation. We see corpses that have been unearthed by the explosion of artillery shells. We see, bodies that have been torn to pieces. We see this just kind of, mass of effluence and mud and gore and just all around horror. And in the background, we see this small farmhouse that Otto Dix describes in his memoirs from his dreams of having to crawl through this kind of landscape, this environment, during one such attack. And it's this recurring source of trauma for him. And if we move into the right panel, we can actually see this, self-portrait of Otto Dix as he's pulling a comrade out of this raging inferno behind him. This inferno that, the author Ernst Junger refers to as the storm of steel. But we can see that Dix is depicted himself as a ghostly husk of his former, self. He's depicted in this very frail kind of way. It's not very, cement or, like opaque or anything like that. It seems like part of him has been ripped away, and it's, questioning, is it ever really going to come back? And then at the bottom, we see depicted several soldiers sleeping in an underground dugout or shelter. But this is also meant to hearken to this idea of the coffin and death and all of this. So even though this is a very horrific painting, its subject matter is extremely brutal. It is not necessarily aesthetically pleasing, but it does have artistic value because of what it has to say about this particular historical event, this particular artist's own, personal experience in it. But I also feel like it speaks a lot to the endurance of the human soul and all of these kinds of ideas, as well as we could take a lot of technical kind of innovation from it. We can look at the way Otto Dix actually painted and take value away from that. Many contemporaries of his discussed how kind of vivid a lot of his work is and how visceral it is. It has a kind of physical quality that sticks off of the actual canvas and everything like that. So we can look at it in terms of value for different reasons, even though we might not necessarily consider it to be beautiful. Once again, this is where subjectivity comes into play. Now, aside from recognizing beauty or bringing delight, another major aspect of art is art being used for commentary, to comment on some specific event or something that's happening in society or history or something like that. And so often art answers a need for, visual information. And in truly interesting kinds of ways, this isn't always accurate. So here we can see this is a war elephant from a French illuminated manuscript from the Middle Ages. from the 1200s by Gilliam LeClerc. But I think it's pretty obvious just looking at this that Gilliam LeClerc probably never saw an elephant in his life. Instead, he's basing his representation off of hearsay or, text or accounts from crusaders coming back to Europe from the Middle East and places like this. So he's really relying on secondhand information to create this. So it's not necessarily, all that accurate. Now, another aspect of this I think is interesting. Here we see a painting known as The Snake Charmer by Jean-Léon Gérôme, and this is one of the most prominent Orientalist artists of the late 19th century. And these are, European artists who would go and depict like exotic subjects from North Africa, the Middle East, and places like that. But if we look in the background of the scene, all of this really nice lusterware tile work with all of this Arabic calligraphy on it looks all beautiful and everything like that. But Jerome did not speak Arabic. In fact, all of this Arabic calligraphy that we see in the background is complete gibberish. It's literally gibberish. And once again, he would have just based this off of things he had seen while traveling, but he didn't actually speak the language. So it's all artistic invention in this regard. So I find that to be interesting. But artists have shaped how people understand the world and how other cultures view each other through things like religion and literacy, or religious literacy in general, but also through things like supremacy and propaganda. And so we'll see examples of these. So here we can see an example of how artists have really shaped our perception of certain, ideas. So on the left here, we can see a modern recreation of what scientists, ethnographers, etymologists, and all of these kinds of people believe the actual face of Jesus might have looked like, based on the genetics of the Middle Eastern, region, as well as, the historical time period and all of that. Conversely, on the right, we have our very blonde, blue-eyed Jesus from, American evangelicalism and everything like that. Now, obviously, Jesus would have lived in the Middle East in ancient times. This is largely a product of medieval, invention to create a kind of colloquial with European peoples. So this image is not historically accurate. However, it does help to cement a kind of connection with non-Middle Eastern people in terms of Christianity and things like that. But once again, this is one way that artists have shaped how we visually experience certain information. Likewise, artwork was used for many, many centuries as a teaching tool in the religious context, such as Caravaggio's The Entombment of Christ here, and it really depicts, or at least informs, how we think about certain biblical events in particular in this context. So we have to think about, in medieval times, most people were completely illiterate, and it was even common for kings to be illiterate at certain points of the medieval period. And this doesn't change, or this isn't helped by the fact that the Bible at this time was exclusively written in Latin. And if you couldn't even read the language you spoke, let alone read or speak Latin, you wouldn't really have any idea what was happening during church services while the liturgy is being said, because it would be said in Latin. So how would you know the stories of your own religion? Well, that's where artwork comes into play, and through things like paintings, such as we see here, or stained glass, or tapestries, or mural paintings on the wall, all kinds of things like that. So artists have really informed how we view certain, information based on religious context as well throughout history. So I have always found that interesting. Now, we can also use artwork to show things like supremacy and to extol certain cultural supremacy. Now, this isn't necessarily a good thing, but it is fairly common throughout time. So if we look at this particular work by Baron Antony Jean Gros, this is Murat at the Battle of Aboukir on the 25th of July, 1799. And what I find interesting about this is it also bridges into the realm of propaganda, in that this is the only battle that Napoleon was victorious in during his entire campaign in Egypt. And so, but it was used to paint a picture of victory in the minds of the French public, because they would have seen the painting long before they ever knew about how much of a failure the Egyptian campaign actually was. But it also supports this idea of French supremacy and French hegemony. And so hegemony is the spreading out of one particular culture to become the dominant force. And at this time, French hegemony was kind of starting to wane down in favor of English hegemony. But what we still see here is the French being depicted as very stalwart and resolute, whereas their enemies, the Ottoman Turkish, army here, are being depicted as very cowardly and all of this kind of stuff. So in the scene, we see General Murat here. General Murat was actually also Napoleon's brother-in-law and was also made the king of Naples by Napoleon. And so this painting originally hung in his throne room. So anyone who went to the court of Murat would have been greeted by it. It would have been a major symbol of his prowess as a leader, both as a king, but also as a general. So we would see him, on this powerful white stallion. He's controlling with only one hand while he's wielding his saber in his other. He doesn't even look like he's all that bothered by the action. He's, once again, very stalwart, very resolute in his kind of demeanor. His soldiers are also depicted in that way. They're not depicted with any fear in their eyes or anything like that. Whereas the Ottoman Turkish soldiers here are all depicted as being afraid. They're running away. I actually really like the fact that their commander here is kind of grabbing the one guy to throw him back. He's the only one who seems to be, really stalwart on their side. But we can also see his attendant trying to surrender his sword at the same time. But once again, this would be meant to echo the supremacy of the French army under Napoleon at this time, which was definitely the most prominent, most powerful military force on the planet at that point. But once again, it's echoing this idea that France had the right to rule in this sense and all of this kind of thing. So it's showing the supremacy of one culture over another. Now, that's obviously not the case. It's very subjective, all that. It gets into racism and all these kinds of things. But artwork can still be used to promote ideas like this. Now, that painting is opposed to, say, this painting, also by Anthony Jean Gros, but shows a little bit of a difference between how Murat has himself depicted and how Napoleon has himself depicted. So Napoleon usually would rather show himself as being rather magnanimous, as being a man for his people. So he's always showing himself kind of taking care of his own people or leading them in victory and all of these kinds of things. So here we see him visiting, the sick at the plague house at Jaffa. So he's going and seeing his sick soldiers in the hospital and whatnot. Much more, kind of an ambivalent kind of presence, as opposed to Murat here, who's leading, a cavalry charge in battle and things like that. Now, that is opposed to, say, the actual reality of Napoleon, who was actually very brutal in many of his military campaigns. In fact, here we can see a work of art by the Spanish artist Francisco Goya representing the kind of aftermath of Napoleon's conquest of Spain. After he conquers Spain, he ousts the last Bourbon king of Spain, who was related to the French king who was beheaded during the French Revolution. And he installs his own brother Joseph on the throne of Spain. And this is very unpopular with the Spanish people, who rise up in revolt against Napoleon. And he very ruthlessly puts this revolt down. And so even though Napoleon liked to have himself depicted as being, very magnanimous, and he helps his people, and he's, victorious, the reality of his regime is actually much more brutal and much more dark, such as we see with Goya's work here. So once again, this starts to get into the realm of things like propaganda as well. Now, In the realm of worship and ritual, art also plays a very significant role. So, art is often used to enhance religious contemplation. So, think about, the art in churches being used to help people who are illiterate learn the stories of the Bible, but also think about, stained glass and all of these kinds of things that might be enhancing our overall spiritual experience. So, I'd like to read a quote here by St. Thomas Aquinas, who stated, "An artwork, if attractively presented, raises viewers to the knowledge of intelligible truth." And so I've always found that to be interesting. And so, we have to think about it in context of, say, like a medieval cathedral, where we would go in, we would hear the liturgy being said, we would hear the choir being sung, we would hear the organ playing, we would see, colored light radiating through the stained glass. We would smell the incense burning and all of this, and all of it is meant to enhance our spiritual experience, to create a link between us in the physical world and the spiritual world beyond. So a lot of religious artwork tries to play this kind of mentality up. And so here we have a nice example of that. Here we have Peter Paul Rubens, the Elevation of the Cross triptych. And this is used for a very specific use. It's actually an altar piece. So this is situated above an altar within a cathedral. And most of the time when Mass wasn't being said, the two wings on either side here would actually be closed, and it would all be opened up as we see here for the Mass itself. But we see, very pivotal, kind of moments within the biblical story. And this is, once again, what would help to, echo, religious literacy for the illiterate. So we can obviously, the main central focus here is the elevation of Christ on the crucifix. We can see, all of the kind of Roman soldiers and whatnot straining to lift. We can see Christ's followers on the left side over here mourning and lamenting, his situation. And then we can see Pontius Pilate and the other two people crucified with Christ there on the right. Now, interestingly, we can also see the addition of an eclipse, a solar eclipse, which is said to have taken place when, Jesus is crucified and all of this kind of stuff. But once again, this would be used to help echo in the minds of the faithful, their religious contemplation and devotion during the specific, Mass and everything like that. But here we can see actually how it's displayed within the context of a cathedral, or of the cathedral where it's located. So when Mass isn't, being said, it's usually closed up. Obviously, they leave it on display quite a bit nowadays and everything. But once again, as we said Mass or listened to Mass, we could look at this and contemplate, Jesus's suffering and, all of that kind of stuff as well. Now, not all religious artworks are created, solely for, use like the painting and whatnot that we just saw. In fact, some of them are used for more utilitarian kinds of reasons. So here we can see what's known as a reliquary arm. And what I find interesting about this and reliquaries in general is that they're used to hold the holy remains or holy objects, or things that are said to be holy objects. This particular one would have originally held the arm bone of a saint. And they're very common. In the 1100s, one of the popes declared that every single church had to have a relic within the walls to sanctify the structure. And so this becomes a very booming trade, especially during the Crusades, where people are going to the Middle East, they're bringing back supposed relics and everything like that. However, what I find interesting about this is there becomes a black market trade in many of these relics. And right now, today, there are enough supposed relics of our friend John the Baptist floating around to make 3 entire John the Baptists. So someone was getting swindled at some point, But it's kind of beside the fact, because these are also objects that are used within religious devotion to help sanctify within the minds of the faithful the legitimacy of the religion and things like that. It's not always the physical remains of saints. Sometimes it's, it might be a splinter from the true cross that, Christ was crucified on, all kinds of things like this. Any and everything could be considered a reliquary if we wanted to. So, such as we see here. So here we have a reliquary cross. This would actually hold a small sliver of the wood from the original crucifix, or at least what is said to be the original crucifix. There's no real telling if that's accurate or not, but it's still an interesting thing to think about. Now, aside from the Christian, sense, we also have, artworks being used for religious devotion in Buddhist art. And so here we have one of the more interesting ones, in my opinion, what's known as a sand mandala. And this is something that's used as a kind of form of meditation. And so monks will actually sit there and create these massive designs out of loose colored sand. And as soon as they're finished with them, they destroy them and they just wipe them away. And the reason for this is to not create attachment to the actual object. Once again, a big portion of Buddhism and achieving enlightenment is foregoing attachments and things like that. So I find it interesting that these are done. They're very painstaking, very meticulous. It can take upwards of a week or two to create one, and then they're just destroyed immediately. But they serve a meditative function. We would be meant to contemplate certain scriptures and things like that while we made them. A lot of the symbolic motifs in them have different meditative qualities as well, and things like this. So I've always found that to be kind of interesting as well. Now, aside from that, we also see, Islamic religious art being used to enhance religious devotion as well, although in a little bit different kind of way. So what we see here is what's known as a mihrab, and this is a small niche in the prayer or the end prayer wall of a mosque that's oriented to face towards Mecca. So this is used to devote, or at least indicate, the direction in which the faithful are meant to pray. We could think of it kind of like an altar in a Christian sense, although it doesn't serve the same ritual purpose. Instead, once again, it's more of an indication rather than an area where something takes place. However, in many of these mihrabs, such as this one that we see here, we see not only that geometric design, but we also see a lot of Arabic calligraphy. And all of this calligraphy is taken directly from the Quran. And as the faithful, if we were in the sanctuary making our prayers, we would actually be meant to read this calligraphy and contemplate it within our own devotion, so that we could, contemplate where we where we were with our own faith, and everything like that. So once again, the calligraphy in this sense, like the imagery in the Christian sense, is also being used to enhance our spiritual experience. Now, that brings us to art as commemoration. So art has often been created in an effort to aid in our memory of people and events. So this takes the place or the form of things like tombs, memorials, even history paintings. And so we'll see some examples. So obviously one of the best examples of a work of art that is a commemoration of something is a tomb. And so one of the greatest examples of tombs in the world are the Great Pyramids of Giza, and that would be the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the pyramid of his son Khafre, and his grandson Menkaure. So the actual Great Pyramid is the one here in the back. But what I find interesting about these is that they are done for a variety of reasons that we'll get into when we discuss ancient Egypt. But part of maintaining one's immortality in the afterlife in ancient Egyptian mythology, your name has to be remembered forever. And so, it's debatable if Khufu is still in the afterlife or whatnot. Once again, that's subject to all kinds of different interpretations. But because of his building here, his tomb, we still know who he is 5,000 years later. And in fact, it's important to note that the Great Pyramid of Khufu was the largest man-made structure on Earth until the building of the Eiffel Tower in 1871. So for 4,500 years, this was the largest man-made structure on the planet. And so it really speaks to the power of Khufu and his legacy and all of these kinds of things. So I've always found that interesting. However, perhaps a more well-known example of a tomb that's commemorating the life of an individual would be that of Tutankhamun, who is an Egyptian pharaoh who ruled about 2,000 years after Khufu during the New Kingdom period, but he's famous because he's the only Egyptian pharaoh whose tomb has been discovered intact. And it's done so because he died young, and it's thought that the tomb he was buried in was not originally intended for him. So it kind of got looked over time. But his tomb is very, very tiny compared to most royal tombs. In fact, it's only 3 tiny little rooms compared to other tombs, such as Seti I here, which is at least 10 or 15 massive rooms. And so Seti I is the pharaoh or the father of Ramses the Great, or Ramses II. But here we can see Seti I's burial chamber as opposed to Tutankhamun's burial chamber. So much different scale there. But we can see in Seti's tomb here, all along the ceiling and the wall, the different aspects of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So these would be the spells and incantations he would need to gain successful entry into the afterlife. I also like that the ceiling of his tomb also depicts the constellations as viewed by the ancient Egyptians and things like that. Now, there are other forms of commemoration in art that we can look at. It's not just tombs, but we also have memorials that are, hearkening to the triumphs of individuals. So here we can see the Arch of Titus, which was built by the Emperor Domitian to commemorate the military exploits of his brother, the Emperor Titus, who had died fairly young. But here we see it as it appears today, although originally it would have been covered in decorative sculpture and all kinds of things like that. But if we look at a close-up here of the interior portion, we can see one of the remaining sculptures, and this is the triumph of Titus as he returned to Rome from sacking Jerusalem. So he brings Judea under the yoke of the Roman Empire, and he sacks the temple of Herod there, and he brings back the spoil. So we can see the menorah there being carried through the streets of Rome in triumph in this case. But once again, this is a archway that's meant to commemorate the military victories of the Emperor Titus, as opposed to, say, his life and death and all of these kinds of things. However, we have other kinds of memorials that, memorialize not just one individual, but a multitude of individuals. So here we can see the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, and this is based on the famous photograph by Joe Rosenthal from the Battle of Iwo Jima. So this is a statue depicting the flag raising at Iwo Jima, but it's come to be synonymous with not only the Marine Corps victory in World War II, but America's victory in World War II, specifically in the Pacific Theater. But what I like about this is that even though these individuals are known to us now, we can't see their face in the image or in the sculpture, and so in that regard, they can almost be anybody. They could be, my brother or my son or my husband or my father or whoever might have sacrificed their lives for this country. And in this regard, it's dedicated to all Marine Corps, servicemen and women who have fallen in combat from the inception of the Marine Corps in 1775 all the way to the contemporary. So it commemorates every one of those individuals and their their kind of heroic sacrifice of life for this country and everything like that. And in that regard, the anonymity of the figures within the image here kind of lends to that idea as well, in my opinion. Now, we can also have, things that commemorate specific events and individuals. So here we see an interesting painting by an early American artist known as Benjamin West. And this depicts the death of General Wolfe. And this is taking place at the Battle of Quebec during the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War as it's known in Europe. But what we see here is an interesting painting in that it's presented to us like a history painting from the time would have been in this heroic scale, although it depicts contemporary events. So it bridges the gap between history and genre painting, which makes it unique for its time. But we can also see it's meant to commemorate this individual, General Wolfe. And it's meant to show that not only is he a competent general, but he's also beloved by his men. And so we can see that his aides are coming to his aid there. They're showing love and affection for him. They're showing their sorrow over his passing. And interestingly, we even have a Native American scout depicted here, which is meant to reference this idea of the connection between the new and old world, as well as the role of Native Americans in this particular, conflict, as well as in this general's kind of victories and everything like that. But what's interesting is that it really does show the beloved quality of this particular individual, as opposed to, a mass of individuals or what have you. So it's kind of unique in that regard. Now, aside from that, we can also use art as a form of persuasion. And so this really gets into the realm of propaganda. And so art has often been used to influence public action and opinion through things like power projections, patriotism, and advertising. So advertising in particular is probably very common or well known to us. We experience it on a daily basis. In fact, a lot of you guys probably have clothing with advertising on it of one kind or another, all kinds of things like that. But, in the realm of persuasion and propaganda, artwork is usually trying to convince us of certain social causes or nefarious kinds of things, and we'll see some examples of that. But it's usually promoting this sense of idealism. And in that regard, we're referring to the removal of all humanly flaws in an effort to promote grandeur of some kind. And in the world of persuasion and propaganda, it's usually being used to convince us that we are better than they in some way. And so this is usually used for nefarious kinds of reasons, but there are a variety of ways that we can go about this. Now, here we see an ancient example of artwork being used to persuade us. And this is what's known as the Augustus of Prima Porta. So this is a sculpture that depicts the first Roman emperor, Augustus. This is the first Roman emperor to take power after the death of Caesar. He's actually the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar. But this promotes a variety of different information, and it's most likely created by one of Augustus's successors later on after his own death. But it promotes certain ideas about the divinity of the Roman emperors and things like that. But first and foremost, looking at the whole of it, we can see his stance here is a very powerful stance of dictation. So this would be echoing his authority as a political ruler or leader and everything like that. So he's making an ode to us, if you will. But then we can also see that he's wearing military armor. So this would be used to symbolically promote his grandeur as a military general or military leader. And it's hard to see in this image, but there are raised images on the top of his armor, and these are meant to show his statesmanship. So this is actually meant to represent Augustus's negotiation for prisoners of war with the Parthian Empire in what is modern-day Iran. And so it's meant to echo not only his idea, the idea that he's a prominent military leader, but he's also a prominent statesman and diplomat and things like that. Now, moving further down, we can see that there are two symbolic motifs here that are used to represent the idea that the Roman emperors are divine beings. And that is first and foremost, we can see the addition of the Cupid here. And in Greco-Roman mythology, Cupid is the son of Aphrodite, or, the goddess of love and desire. And the Julian family, of which Augustus is a part of, claim to be descendants of Aphrodite. And so this is making a reference to his claim to divine origin. However, we can also see that Augustus is depicted barefoot here. And this is very important because in ancient Greco-Roman times, specifically in ancient Greece, to be depicted barefoot was reserved for only a very select few kinds of representation, i.e., for gods, and for heroes. So people who had achieved a divine-like status based on their exploits, or their quasi-divine status, things like that. So by being depicted barefoot here, whoever's created this particular sculpture is making an homage to the fact that Augustus was a living god, if you will. Now, this is something that Augustus himself never made any pretenses to, so it's thought that this was created by later Roman emperors to cement this idea of their divine power to rule. This is definitely very much promoted by the Emperor Nero, who is third in line after Augustus, and everything like this. But it's also a major reason why Christianity and Roman, paganism kind of did not get along early on. The Roman emperors made it law that they had to worship the emperor as a living god, and Christians did not, kind of recognize the divinity of the Roman emperor, and so that brings them into conflict, if you've ever wondered why that was. But once again, this is promoting certain narrative ideas about the status of the Roman emperors themselves. Now, this is nothing new, though. Kings and rulers have been doing this, trying to persuade us of their grandeur and everything like that for many, many centuries. Here we can see an example. This is an exterior view painting of the Palace of Versailles. And this was the palace where the French monarchy held its court between the reign of Louis XIV and Louis XVI, when it was the French monarchy was kind of overthrown by the French Revolution. But it's a massive, grandiose palace, and it's even bigger today than it is in this particular painting. But everything about it was meant to cement the idea that the French monarchy was, a divinely inspired monarch. So they had divine sanction to rule. Their power was great. Their wealth was great. Everything about it was meant to promote these kinds of ideas, that their power was infallible, that their wealth was infallible, all of this kind of stuff. And in fact, if we look in the interior of the palace, here we see the Hall of Mirrors. Every square inch of this palace is fully decked out in gold, in gems, in paintings, and sculptures, and all kinds of luxury. And it's truly overwhelming to behold. If you've ever been there, if you get a chance to go, it's truly overwhelming. And what's interesting is that all diplomats in Europe would have gone to this palace at one time, and they would have been overwhelmed by it. And in fact, in the span of about 100 years, every monarch in Europe had a palace just like it. So it's really being used to promote the grandeur of the French kings, if you will. Now, these are all, promoting certain ideas about power and whatnot. But there is another form of persuasion that art can take, and that is pure propaganda. And so propaganda itself usually blends contemporary design disciplines and advertising in a way to make us believe certain things or certain narratives. Now, advertising and propaganda have been used to influence cultural values and public opinion for good or not. So advertising is the kind of good version of it, where, it's like, they're trying to persuade us that Coke is better than Pepsi, or, what have you. Whereas propaganda is usually trying to make us view certain political ideology as being superior to another and things like that. And so, once again, propaganda usually takes on a much more nefarious kind of connotation. But I do want to show 3 examples of propaganda posters to you guys. Each of them is from World War II, but each is coming from a different background. So it kind of highlights the different uses for propaganda. So here we can see the first one, and this is an American propaganda poster that's aimed at the American people. And it says, "You talk of sacrifice, he knew the meaning of sacrifice." And what this is referring to is war rationing. And so during World War II, everything was rationed, from sugar to coffee to, metal to, you name it, gasoline, everything. And a lot of people didn't like it. And, you might have to go a day or two a week without having your morning coffee and things like that. So a lot of people tried to, get around it by using, the black market and things like that. But this is imploring, the people of the United States to be at one with the sacrifices being made by servicemen overseas during the conflict. So it's in part trying to create a commonality between the experiences, in that people on the home front, even though they're, living in relative peace and everything, well, you still have to do your part to ensure our victory. So it helps to create a common kind of goal for all citizens, if you will, things like that. But once again, it's also, asking people to be all right with, impositions on their lives, because obviously we got people fighting for us that are risking their lives, and doing a whole lot more. And yet there are people complaining that, oh, well, I couldn't eat sugar today or whatnot. And a lot of parallels with what's happening right now, I feel like, but that's a different story. But here we can see a little bit different kind of propaganda poster, and this was a propaganda poster made by the German army, and it was aimed at German and Italian civilians. And so what we see here is this kind of composite creature, which is representing a variety of different aspects of the United States, and it says liberators. And so it's almost a sardonic statement, a mockingly scornful statement, in that, here we have this kind of composite creature which is built up of, hypocrisies and low culture and everything. And it's come to Europe to destroy this quote unquote high culture. And so we see, African American people in a cage here. We see aspects of, like racial injustice with lynching, the Ku Klux Klan, this kind of low party, lifestyle coming out of the Roaring '20s with like jazz music and prize fighting and, all of these kind of things. This kind of gangster mentality coming out of the '30s with like organized crime, the mafia, and things like that. And, here we are bringing our war machine and devastating European culture. And it's fairly accurate in that we basically leveled all of Germany and Italy with massive bombing raids. In fact, we destroyed huge amounts of, artwork and historic architecture doing so. In fact, in Italy, an American bomb dropped on the building that houses, Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, nearly destroying that work of art forever. And it very narrowly survived, but we did destroy huge amounts of historic artwork and architecture that can never be regained. And so it's pointing out these kinds of hypocrisies to Italian and German citizens, and saying, why should you surrender to them or help them out, because they're devastating us, if you will. But likewise, we also have, works that really play up these kinds of ideas of racism and things like that. So this is another poster that was made by the German army, but it was geared towards or aimed at the Ukrainian people. And it's really trying to exploit the idea of a massacre that took place at Vinnitsa, which is what the text says down here. And and this is also referring to a period in the 1930s in Ukraine known as the Holodomor. And this is a period where the Soviet government collectivized all of the agriculture under state operation. and all people had to basically, become state employees again. And this was not very popular because most Russian peasants had just been liberated from serfdom only about 30 or 40 years prior to this. And basically, what happened is that anyone who resisted the collectivization of agricultural land under the state would basically be murdered. And so these, communist commissars, this kind of early political thought police, if you will, this a forerunner to the KGB, would go through and they would instill the communist government's will on the people. And so at this particular place, Vanitsa, the people resisted this collectivization of their agricultural land, which had basically just been, given to them not long prior to that. And they were massacred for resisting it. And so the German army is trying to play up, these kinds of racial hatreds between the Ukrainians and the Russian communists, who they generally make a link to being Jewish in origin. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels are both, the writers of the Communist Manifesto are both Jewish in origin and everything like that. So there comes to be within Nazi propaganda a link between, communism and Judaism. And even though that's not really the case, but we can see that the communist commissar, has a very unflattering kind of stereotypically Jewish depiction here. And once again, it's playing up racial hatred and fears and things like that. This is also being used to help incite pogroms against the Jewish population of the Ukraine and all kinds of horrible things like that. Ironically, though, the German army would actually commit their own massacre at the same place just a few years after this poster was issued. But once again, it's highlighting one of the more regrettable aspects of propaganda in general. Now, to end us off on a little bit of a lighter note for this lecture, we'll talk about art as self-expression. So self-expression is a fairly new concept in art history. Prior to probably the 19th century, most artists are really working more on commission than just for themselves. And we'll get into that in a second. But expressiveness embodies the individual experience over all else. So, self-expression in art usually is looking at things, like personality, personal feelings, our own worldviews, social courses, as well as aesthetic urges, etc., etc. And so we're then making artwork about these kinds of things. But self-expression in art becomes more reliant on direct artist to viewer empathy than anything else. So it's assuming that we as the viewer are going to see the self-expression the artist has put out, and then we're going to empathize with them, and therefore we become somewhat akin to the artists themselves, or at least we can take on certain aspects of how they're feeling and what they're working through and all of these kinds of things. Now, it is important to note that basically prior to about the middle of the 19th century, almost all artists are working under the patronage system. And so they're creating works of art not necessarily for themselves, but at the behest of, someone who's paying them for the work. So a lot of artists work for, royalty, nobility, the church, all kinds of things like that. And these people are dictating what the artist is creating. But this starts to change at about the Renaissance period. We start to see a little bit more freedom. But prior to the Renaissance, really, almost all artists worked as anonymous craftsmen. And so they would usually work under the guild system. And so here we can see this is the coat of arms for the Guild of St. Luke. This was the guild that regulated, artisans and craftspeople. There'd be a guild for someone who made armor or weapons and all kinds of stuff like that. But, until about the Renaissance, you had to be a member of the guild in order to create work. You were not usually known individually for the artwork that you made. So it was almost always completely anonymous. It's not till the Renaissance that we start to see individuals recognized for their own personal genius if you will, things like that. And then it's really not until the middle of the 19th century with the Impressionists that you start to see, artists making artwork that's personally self-expressive and things like that. However, one of the first real artists to be truly self-expressive and really well known for this is Vincent van Gogh, and he's probably one of the more tumultuous artists. Very tragic figure, very tragic life. He's actually an outsider artist, so he comes to art much later in life. He's, I believe, in his early 20s when he begins, as opposed to many of the old masters who begin as children and everything like that. But I also think it's interesting that he never sold more than one painting in his entire lifetime. Yet now his paintings sell for hundreds of millions of dollars, kind of ironically. But very tragic individual, and a lot of his self-expressive quality within his artwork, this kind of impressionistic breakdown of form into individual brushstrokes, is at least thought by some, and in my personal opinion, I believe, is really devoted to a lot of his the trauma in his life. It's known that he was a severe alcoholic, and he was probably drinking a lot of bootleg alcohol that was made with things like turpentine and kerosene and things that will make you hallucinate and all kinds of stuff like this. It's also thought that he might have eaten his oil paint out of desperation at a few times in his life. And if you're unfamiliar, oil paint has a lot of very toxic materials like lead and cobalt and other things that can, cause you very adverse health effects and everything like that. So it's thought that some of these things might have contributed to the way his paintings look, that he might have actually been hallucinating like this in real life. It's known that he spent a few years in and out of mental institutions before he ultimately committed suicide and everything like this. But what he has left to us is one of the greatest kind of legacies of personally expressive and tragic kind of artwork. And I think it's interesting because it's very beautiful artwork in that it's also very tragic at the same time. So I've always found his work very interesting. But just one more very, kind of personally expressive artist that can really highlight the idea that artists don't necessarily have to adhere to one thing their entire careers. This is Gustav Klimt, the Kiss. And Gustav Klimt began his career as a very academically oriented artist, very realistic, very old master-like quality in subject and in surface quality. But toward the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, he begins to abandon that academicism for this much more personally expressive, symbolic kind of representation. And so he also starts to embrace multimediaism. And so a lot of his works, such as this, embrace abstraction and collage and gold leaf and other unnatural materials or unpainterly kinds of materials and all kinds of stuff like that. But they begin to take on much more personal and much more intimate kinds of subject matters and representations and things like that. So this is something that continues into the 20th and 21st centuries, with a lot of the early modernist artists being much more wholeheartedly self-expressive and everything like that with their work. But that ends us for today with the nature of work, or the nature of art and everything like that. So next time we will discuss some of the visual elements as well as the principles of design. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.